Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is video number 2, where we are going to start putting together the engine after we have done the machine shop visits and got all the necessary parts for the rebuild. The first video is the teardown, so if you haven't seen that, be sure to check that out. It's just one video and it's only about 17 minutes long, and it's the complete disassembly of the engine. This is a 1NZ FE that goes in the Toyota Echo, the Toyota Yaris, the Scion XB, and Scion XA. It's not uncommon for these engines to have the cylinders bored out and get your crankshaft ground, because these normally get between 300,000 and 400,000 miles. Sometimes people get more than that. So that's not uncommon for physics to make its claim and make the cylinders a slight oval shape, and then you have to bore them out. And that's what happened in my case. This block had to be bored out 0.5 millimeter over, and the crankshaft 10 thousandths. And that's okay, that's fine. There was a lot of evidence that this engine did have a lot of miles on it. So anyways, let's get started, and I'll show you how to put this back together. Hey guys, so first step with pistons is we want to measure the piston to wall clearance. Now, depending on what your plans are with your engine, it's going to change your specs for your piston to wall clearance. If you are going with cast pistons, you're going to get a tighter spec clearance from the manufacturer. If you go forged, those pistons can heat up and expand more, so generally you'll have a larger clearance. So you need to go with what the manufacturer says, and also make sure that your machine shop is measuring as well. But it is always a good idea to audit your machine shop, because you never know if they hired some high school kid that doesn't know what he's doing, or if he skipped a cylinder while he went to lunch. It's just always safer to measure yourself. What I did is I copied and pasted piston pictures from Google and just did 4 of them. So I got piston 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then I measured 3 different spots on the piston for the width, and then took that reading, and you can lock in that, get a micrometer that has a lock, so you lock in that width of your piston. Then you get a dial bore gauge, and see how it's got this little plunger on this side? That's what makes the needle move. So when you put this in the micrometer, you get it to where it's pushing on it just a little bit, and it's gonna move wherever it goes, right? Then you take your gauge and zero it out, and then that captures the width of your piston. So then you pull this out, go stick it in the piston, or in the cylinder, sorry, and I measured top, middle, and bottom, and when it goes in the cylinder, that plunger's gonna just push out just a little further out than what the piston width was, and it's gonna give you a reading just off of the zero as it expands, and then that's your clearance. And mine goes to 5/10 thousandths, which isn't the best, but if you can afford one of these dial bore gauges down to 1/10 thousandths, that is better. But all of my readings were over 10. And for my pistons, the spec I got is to be within 8 to 19 thousandths. And all 4 of mine were 11 or 12. That one was 11, that one was 12, 11, and 11. And that's down at the lower. See, I put A, B, C, and that matches where I measured A, B, C. So down at the piston skirt where it's widest, because pistons are a tapered shape, I'm in my safe zone. So just make sure you go off of whatever the manufacturer says, and audit your machine shop. If you've never used these tools before, a micrometer and a dial bore gauge, there's a lot of videos on YouTube on how to educate yourself how to use those. So Next, we will move on to the piston rings. All right, guys, so I wanted to show you first what I did at the machine shop. Here's my bill. My total was $1,450. Last time I did an engine, it was like $800. This inflation is crazy. So what I did is I had them clean the engine block. They soaked it in a hot tank with solvent. They bored it out. They decked the surface, which is here. Made sure that's nice and smooth. They ground the crankshaft, the rod and mains. They checked my stock connecting rods to make sure they're inspect and reusable. They removed the old pistons, put on the new ones. They cleaned the cylinder head, resurfaced the head, did a valve job, adjusted the valves for valve lash, and then they soaked and cleaned the valve cover and that base plate part of the block. So, here's one of the old pistons. You'll notice how on the new one, in the oil ring, you got these little holes in here. That's for oil to drain back into the oil pan area. On this one, you can see they are clogged, totally clogged shut. That is one reason why you want to change your oil frequently, because once those holes plug up, it actually can cause the oil rings to seize once they're cold into a position you don't want them to be stuck in. Next time you start the engine, they're just going to be scraping your cylinder walls like crazy, and then you can make them an oval shape, then you lose compression. So we are going to start off with piston rings. So my pistons are oversized. The dealer said they do not offer oversized pistons. Why would they? That's not a stock thing. So you're now shopping in the aftermarket world, and you'll find a lot of Chinese stuff, or you got to pay tons of money for performance. I asked the machine shop, do you guys have any providers that actually make pistons in the US? Because I do not want Chinese. They said there's a company called Safety Auto Parts that manufactures these pistons in California. Hopefully that's true. They provide piston rings with their pistons from Hastings. Hastings has been around a long time. They're a well-established brand. They are made in the United States. So when you get your piston rings, you'll notice that on the piston, you've got 3 grooves. You got first, second, and third. Your piston ring set will come with a first, second, and then these 3 go in the third. This is your oil ring. This is called the expander. And then these are called oil scrapers. You got one that goes above and one that goes below, all together fitting in this groove. First, before you install them, there's some measuring you need to do. Now here's my measuring chart I already did, but I'm going to show you how to do piston number 1, and then you guys go ahead and do it to the rest of them. So I already marked this as piston number 1, and as you measure your piston ring specs, you make sure it's to the cylinder they're going to go in. I'm going to measure those, will be specific for number 1, and then my other ones I already did here, 2, 3, and 4 are specifically measured in each individual cylinder they're going to go in, and then you don't mix and match. You want to just, what you measure, make sure you put it back in. Okay, so first we're going to start with orientation. This is how the machine shop gave my connecting rods back to me with my new pistons installed. These are the original connecting rods. These are forged from the factory, and they are still in spec. So there's nothing wrong with them. They're still good. If you're going to turbo your engine, then yeah, go ahead and get the bigger, beefier ones. But I'm running stock, so this is going to work just fine. What you want to check for are 3 things. You look on the bottom, you'll notice the connecting rod cap's got these 3 bump parts here on this side and only 2 on this side. These 3 point to the front of the engine. On the connecting rod itself, the side that's got the numbers in them, not on the back, that side goes towards the front of the engine. And then you want to make sure on the piston itself, that little dot right there goes to the front of the engine. So those three things line up. Next, we're going to fit the piston rings and then install them. Piston ring number 1 usually will have a chrome finish on it. Let's see if I can get this to focus. There we go. And it's got oil on it. The piston rings will tell you which side is the side that needs to face up. It says top right there. These piston rings have a bevel on one side and not on the other. If you install those in upside down, you can have excessive oil consumption. First thing we check with your piece, first get your piece of paper, and you're just going to write piston number 1. Okay, so what you're going to do is have, this is piston number 1, and then you'll do piston 2, 3, and 4, and you're going to make a little chart like this. Back spacing, ring groove, and end gap, and then you can write down what you measure it at in each of these lines, and then file this and save it somewhere. As you're going, if there's a discrepancy, you can show the machine shop and say, hey, you guys need to double check something. On the oil rings, I could not find specs anywhere for back spacing or ring groove for the expander. I don't think there is any. And then for those little 2 scraper rings, you are supposed to measure the end gaps for those. So there's the first one and the second one. So let's start with back spacing for ring number 1. Back spacing, what you're looking for is you set the ring, this is the first groove, and you can see how it's recessed in the groove. If it was sitting up like this and poking out, that would be bad. You would need different pistons. You need the ring to sit in lower than the edge of the piston. Reason why is because when the explosion comes in down on the piston, it goes on top of the piston ring, goes in and to the back of the ring, and makes the ring expand outwards. So the explosion actually helps seal against itself. So that means there needs to be space behind the piston ring, and there also needs to be space on top of the piston ring. That's the ring groove clearance we're going to do next. So this piston ring checks out. It is less than the wall of the piston. If it was like that, that's bad. If it's lower than, that's good. Check. Okay, to measure ring groove clearance, we're going to take the top piston ring and you stick it in the top groove like this, and you're going to measure the top distance between the ring and the groove using a feeler gauge. Now the book says it needs to be 0.03 to 0.07. So I'm going to just start with 0.05 and see if that fits. Take this and just stick it in the groove. And that is too big. So we're going to go down 1 to 0.04. You can feel it starts to want to go in, but it still doesn't go in. We're going to go with 0.03. There it is. There's a tiny bit of friction you can feel, but overall it goes in and out just fine. Ring groove clearance is 0.03. Now we're going to measure the end gap. So normally you'll have the engine tilted up. I've got it tilted forward so you can see what I'm doing. So what you do, this is ring number 1 for cylinder 1. You're going to actually install it with your hands. And you actually compress it into the cylinder bore. And there's that tiny little gap in the opening. There's a spec for that gap. As the engine heats up, it's piston rings like this, the metal expands and that gap closes up. If the gap is too small and it touches each other, then the piston ring is going to expand kind of like an oval shape. And then it's going to scrape up the inside of your cylinder wall. If it's too big to start with and it closes up, and then that's as big, you know, as far as it closes, you've got all that lost power going through and under your piston rings, and you lose power. So it's a balancing act. So the engineers came up with a range specifically for that gap. So what you do, put it in with your fingers, and then take your new piston and just put it right on top of it, and just push it down a little bit. That helps square it so it's level. Spec for this is 0.25 to 0.35. And more often than not, that's a common spec, so they made this feeler gauge golden because most people are going to be using that. So, let's see if I can... there we go. That fits. There's not a lot, I mean, it feels like it's just right, but it's probably bigger than 0.25. So now let's try 0.28. A lot more resistance on that one. That might be a little too tight, so it's between 0.25 and 0.28. We'll just go up one more. 0.30. Yeah, that one doesn't fit. So safely it's 0.25. 0.28 was iffy, but I'm just going to put that down as 0.25. So with end gaps, not everyone knows to do this, but you want to measure at the top of the cylinder and the bottom. So I put a T for top and a B for bottom. The top was 0.25 millimeters. Now we're going to measure the bottom. So I'll show you guys this. In the book, they say get the piston ring down about 4.33 inches down from the top of the cylinder block. Then measure there. Doing this will tell you if your cylinder has a taper to it. If you're getting a tiny reading at the top, bigger reading at the bottom, that means your cylinder is a cone shape and you need to take it back to the machine shop and have them either re-hone it or maybe even bore it out bigger. But you want the same measurement at the top as you do on the bottom. So using the piston, slowly and gently, I'm going to push it down to the bottom. So I got my millimeter ruler and got it down. That's about 4.3 inches down. I'm going to reach up under the bottom here. It's hard with the left hand, but... Okay. That's my 0.25. And I do feel friction in that gap, so I'm thinking that's right on the money, same as the top. Just to be safe, I'm going to check with my 0.28. Okay, so it was the same exact readings, top and bottom, 0.25 millimeters. Okay, so that completes fitting ring number 1. Now we're going to move to ring number 2. Notice on this one, it doesn't say top. They put a little dot on it. Let's get it to focus. There's the dot right there. So that's the top you want facing up when you actually put it on the piston ring. So just like the first, put it in the groove. Check for if it goes lower than the wall of the piston, not like this. Let's see. You don't want it poking up at all. You want it recessed like that. So it passes that. Then, as far as ring groove clearance, where you check the feeler gauge on the top, the spec for that is there's ring number 1. Ring number 2 is 0.02 to 0.06. And then as far as doing the ring end gap, there's ring number 1. Number 2 is 0.35 to 0.5. You guys might want to pause the screen and print this for your specs. I'll put it like that and you guys can print this. But same thing as the ring number 1. Same exact process, measure that and write it all down. Okay, that completes piston ring number 2. With the expander, you don't really do anything, at least in the book. See how those ends flare up? The instructions from Hastings says make sure you install those in the piston pointing upwards. Now with your scrapers, you measure the end gap. You do the same thing you did on piston 1 and 2, installing it in the cylinder and then measuring this gap with a feeler gauge. Mine were a little on the high side, but still within spec. Oil side rail, 0.10 to 0.35. All of mine, all 8 of them were 0.70. Maximum end gap for oil, 0.82. So I'm still within spec. I called Hastings just to make sure. They said that it won't make a difference at all and it's still in spec, so I wouldn't have a problem. So hopefully that's true. Okay, so with installation, you do the expander first. Make sure that those pointy ends are pointing to the top of the piston. And this is the easiest part. You put it in on one side and it just flexes around. Super easy. And there you go. All right, with the scrapers, I do it going away from me, but you position it with your thumb where it's going to go. This one's going to go on the bottom of the expander. You carefully, you don't want to tweak it and destroy it, so you give it as little flex as you can possibly get away with. Just like that, so that one's in the bottom. Do the same thing for the top. Gonna hold it with your thumb. Just gonna gently coax it around. Don't let it scratch the piston. And then you can feel it snap into place. Now what you want to be able to tell that it's not binding anywhere. So you kind of can wiggle it and spin a little bit. If there's any binding, you might have the wrong ones. Now, when I'm installing these, I'm not worrying about the orientation yet. These gaps have to be oriented in a certain way for optimal compression and to reduce oil consumption. I'm just going to install the rings and then orient them the right way when I'm ready to install the pistons themselves. For these, they're stiffer and easier to damage, so I'm using piston ring pliers. They've got this grooved area, and the piston ring just sits in like that, and then you just open it up just a little, and you only want to open just enough to get it over the piston head. Whoops. Just enough. And I use my thumb and help it seat in that back groove. Angle it right and then let go. Now, second ring is in. And when we're getting ready to install it, we'll be able to stick it out and audit it one last time before we put it in the cylinder that we got them right side up. So next is our first ring. Make sure it says top right there, which it does. Same thing, just enough to get it over the edge. Use your thumb to help it get in the groove and then let go. Okay, and those are installed. So now, wrap this in a bag, set it aside. You'll notice that this is marked number 1, and you'll repeat this for pistons 2, 3, and 4. Okay, so that's all 4 pistons done, and I marked each one. Each piston is assigned to the cylinders that I measured for. I didn't measure all the piston rings in one cylinder. All the cylinder 1 piston rings were measured only for this bore. 2s were for number 2, 3 for 3, 4 for 4. So I know exactly what specs are for each cylinder. So now we're going to set this aside and we're going to move